Chapter 3 Society and Culture in Provincial America. So, population growth. Population grew because of both natural increase and immigration, though it varied how much of each from colony to colony. The main work source was indentured servitude in this time period. Passage to America was paid by the contract holder with whom the person has to serve a certain number of years once they reach America. And then after you serve your contract, it was promised that you would get land and money and such as that, but that didn't happen for most people. So, because of that, they were a source of social unrest. They were told they were going to get such things, but they didn't. So they were upset. In the New England colonies, there was a long life expectancy because the climate was similar to that of England. However, in the Chesapeake region, there was a higher mortality rate because of disease and just the environment. However, after a period of seasoning, getting used to the area, they would experience more natural population growth. So in the Chesapeake region, much of the population growth was from immigration. In this time period, where there's a more balanced gender ratio of males to females, so therefore thus reasons for natural increase. As far as medicine goes, they have no knowledge of sterilization, and the physicians were few and far between. Most physicians based their practices on humoralism, which included bleeding and such to bleed out whatever was wrong with you. And there were also midwives that helped with, women going through labor, but also things physicians do. So in areas that did have a high mortality rate, families are difficult to maintain. So that undermined male authority a little bit because if, say, a woman loses her husband, then she has a little bit more power than if that husband were alive and were having control over her. The women had more freedom and power in the South than in the North, because in the North, families were set up in their initial colonies, like Jamestown. But as families grew more stable, patriarchy revived, making males the primary authority in both the home and in the government, and such as that. Then we, as time goes on, we start slavery. So initially, slaves are going to South America and the Caribbean, but then we start getting slaves because in the South we have certain crops that require slaves. The Middle Passage is the journey from Africa to the Americas, and it was very harsh conditions both in the passage and on the ships that they were carried in, and on the plantations that they were at. Slavery in the 1600s, blacks and whites were somewhat equal, but in the 1700s, whites began seeing blacks as the inferior race, and they began putting them in permanent servitude. They were like, hey, these people, they know how to work, and there's no contract like in your servants. We can just make them work for their whole lives. Easy. Sorry about that. So then they started putting into effect slave codes, which limited black rights severely and gave white masters almost complete authority over them. So back to immigration again. There were different types of people that came to the Americas. There were the French Calvinists, also called Huguenots, German Protestants, which were called the Pennsylvania Dutch, Scottish Presbyterians from Ireland, who moved into the outskirts of settlements because they weren't popular, and Scottish Highlanders, as well as Catholic Irish. They came for reasons like economic reasons, religious reasons, and such as that. In the colonies, there were different bases for their economies. In the South, there was tobacco, rice, and indigo, and rice in particular was a labor-intensive crop, which led to slavery. And in the North, the climate wasn't as well suited for heavy agriculture, but the agriculture that was there was more diverse than in the South. The South had the three main crops, but the North had a variety of them. Also in the North, they had a lot of different industries, such as industry in the home, water power, shipbuilding, and ironworks particularly. However, the British didn't like that the colonists were making their own little industries, so they were like, we're going to put this Iron Act in place, and this will restrict your metal processing, okay? We don't want you doing that. No. Also in the colonies, they had extractive industries which made use of their natural resources like lumber, mining, and fish. So as far as colonial commerce goes, there was a shortage of currency, so they relied on a kind of barter system or crude money substitutes like beaver skins. Because there was so many different things going on, it was nearly impossible to stabilize the trade in the colonies. Speaking of trade, there was trade going on between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. It's called the triangular trade, but it was not that simple as just a triangle between each other. There were many different ways between all those three areas. Then, the British got mad at the colonies for trading with other people other than British because it ruined their whole mercantilist ideas. So they set in place the Navigation Acts, which ban all non-British ships from colonial trade. However, colonists don't care, so they just keep doing what they want. They disregard the law and continue trade with the other countries. So then, all this commerce leads to the rise of consumerism, which is a focus on material goods and association of material goods with social status. It was largely based on the division of American society by class, and because more and more products were being made locally than from abroad, though they continued to get a lot of trade from other countries. So, in England, their land is scarce, and the population is large, so the amount of land you have shows your wealth. But in the Americas, people are scarce and land is abundant. So the show of wealth in the Americas is how many people you control or how much is in your workforce. So, plantations. They're primarily in the Chesapeake region because of the crops and grown there. Because plantations are self-contained communities, often with slaves. Southern society is stratified with planters as the dominating class. Slavery on the plantation leads to a development of slave culture within the Africans. They form kinship groups, focus on their language and their religion. However, there are instances of rebellion within the slaves, because there was the Stono Rebellion, which was a South Carolina slave revolt. It was an attempt to escape to Florida, but white whites stopped them. They stamped that out. And, as I said before, whites are really afraid of the slave revolts, even though they don't usually succeed, except for in Haiti. So, Puritan community. The Puritans are united in a group, and that's built to foster community. They have a town meeting yearly, and then they vote on selectmen to govern until the next meeting. However, as populations of the Puritan community grew, lots of people started getting, not on purpose, but they began moving far away from the church because they had to, so they started new communities. So then the Puritans, their strict society, there began to be rumor mongering that some of these women were witches. They were women convicted who didn't. Like, the women who were convicted, they didn't fit into the Puritan society, that they were like widows or unmarried women. And they thought that was a threat to their society. They were like, hey, you're a witch! And then they convicted them of witchcraft, even though they didn't really do anything. So then, cities. Nothing in the New World really classifies as a city by art standards, but there were large towns, such as Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Charlestown. Those were the 4 largest in the colonies at this time period. The cities were disparities of wealth, where some were really rich and some were really poor. They were centers of trade, and they also had urban problems like crime, traffic, etc. Religion, as far as religion goes, there were religious toleration in the colonies. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. There were so many people there of different faiths, they had to tolerate them. Unless they were, not nice. However, Protestants were more tolerant of other Protestants than they were of the Catholics, because they were like all afraid of the Pope and whatnot. So then there began to be a decline of religious piety and growing secularism. So there began what was called the Great Awakening. Ministers started preaching sermons of despair called Jeremiads. The Great Awakening emphasized potential for every person to break away from their past and start over in their relationship with God. Important evangelists in the Great Awakening included John and Charles Wesley, George Whitefield, and Jonathan Edwards in particular. He believed that salvation was by God's grace alone. You cannot do anything to get saved. So, the Great Awakening caused a division between existing congregations and the founding of new ones. A division between old light traditionalists and new light revivalists. So, in addition to the Great Awakening, a kind of contrast would be the Enlightenment, which emphasized human reason over constant dependence on God's guidance. It challenged traditional authority, because, many of these communities were based on religious reasons. The Enlightenment ideas in America were borrowed from Europe at this time period, though later on many people would start having their own Enlightenment ideas. And now education. There were like public schools in some areas. Massachusetts said that there should be a public school in every town. Even though it did not get in every town, there was certainly a spread. And because of that, there was high white literacy rates. And however, many families high white literacy rates mainly because in these religious communities you got to be able to read the Bible. But then there began circulating what's called an almanac, which circulated information, news, and as well as entertainment and little proverbs. Benjamin Franklin wrote an almanac called Poor Richard's Almanac. However, black literacy was discouraged because if the blacks can read, then they'll start getting ideas of their own, and who knows what could happen if they did that. Oh my goodness. So then, there were schools, but now there's colleges. Most of them were initially founded to train clergymen, such as Harvard, William and Mary, Yale, and Princeton. Many of the ones we now know today as they're really hard to get into. However, they also included liberal curricula as well as the training of clergymen. And then science. There was an increased interest in scientific knowledges in the colonies. Benjamin Franklin was an important one. He connected electricity with lightning. A man named Cotton Mather came up with the idea of inoculation of smallpox, which helped prevent disease. And then also with the Enlightenment, there became new ideas about law and politics. However, the colonies had many laws and practices like in England. However, they had some of their own. They didn't have like death punishments usually. They usually had like humiliation or injury like tar and feathers and whipping post, etc. The case of John Peter Zenger, who criticized the king in his newspaper, helped to establish freedom of speech in the press. And as usual, the colonial colonies wanted self-government without interference. The colonial government was mostly local and independent of Parliament, and they wanted to keep it that way. And that is all for Chapter 3.